You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the BioHealth Capital Region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in BioHealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk. And we have a repeat visitor back to BioTalk, but in a different role today. Kolaleh Eskandanian is the program director for SPARK, and you may have remembered her as the chief innovation officer at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C., which she's still being affiliated with through this program. But she's bringing two entrepreneurs to BioTalk with her who are participating in the BARDA SPARK Accelerator program, which we're going to hear more about on this podcast today. We're going to have Dori Jones, co-founder and CEO of AcQumen Medical, and Jugal Suthar, co-founder and CEO of Vesynta, who are cohort members of the SPARK Accelerator. So welcome to BioTalk, everyone.
Thank you, Rich, for having us.
Glad to have you. And we're going to find a way that we can do three people on one podcast today together. So let's start with Kolaleh. Some of you may remember her, but for those who don't, why don't you please introduce yourself to our BioTalk listeners, Kolaleh?
Thank you so much, Rich. Yeah, I truly feel like I earned the frequent flyer status in your podcast. Thanks for having me back. I'm Kolaleh Eskandanian, and my career has really centered on translating innovation into meaningful impact for children and families. My journey started in engineering. By background, I'm a mechanical engineer, and then evolved through management science, strategy consulting, and ultimately into healthcare innovation, where I found my passion. I spent more than 16 years at Children's National Hospital. As you mentioned, I was the executive director of the Sheikh Zayed Institute for Pediatric Surgical Innovation, served as the vice president and chief innovation officer, and built Innovation Ventures, which was the hospital's commercialization arm. That's relevant to this talk to mention that this Innovation Ventures had four pillars. The first pillar, the traditional transactional tech transfer and IP management. Second, related to our today's talk, accelerator programs to de-risk early ideas, which was made possible through two federally funded programs I was the principal investigator of. Third was partnership development with industry and investors, thanks in large to partners such as BioHealth Innovation and funding mechanism. This was guidance to getting innovation-focused non-dilutive funding such as SBIR and STTRs, all to advance commercialization. So together, those four pillars created one of the nation's leading pediatric innovation ecosystems. With respect to the second pillar, as I mentioned, I was the PI for two major federally funded programs that brought over $35 million to Children's National. As PI, I brought those funds. And the first was the FDA-supported National Capital Consortium for Pediatric Device Innovation, later rebranded to the Alliance for Pediatric Device Innovation. And then the second was the SPARK, which is funded by BARDA. Through these programs, we can really help move hundreds of pediatric technologies from concept to clinic. And no matter where these brilliant ideas come from, internal to Children's National or external. So today, as you mentioned, I have several hats today. After I left Children's National, I took an industry role with Compremium AG, which is a Swiss medtech company with non-invasive diagnostic aid and monitoring technologies. I continue to serve my role with BARDA as program director of SPARK. And having gone through an executive education in venture capital and private equity at Columbia Business School, I joined Citrine Angels as an angel investor where I support women-led ventures. I also continue to mentor young entrepreneurs and startup founders navigating early growth and regulatory pathways. And I started to formally take board position in companies in whose mission I strongly have an interest in.
Well, Kolaleh, what a background, and very well prepared to be one of the leaders of this accelerator program to mentor emerging entrepreneurs. So before we get into Dori and Jugal, talk a little bit about why BARDA wanted to do this, a little bit about their accelerator network, and what's unique about this accelerator that's affiliated with Children's National.
So SPARK stands for Special Populations Accelerator for Research and Knowledge, and is part of the BARDA Accelerator Network 2.0. There are 4 other accelerators in the country. So together there are 5 hubs forming BARDA Accelerator Network. And it's a national effort that is led by the Department of Health and Human Services to strengthen our country's preparedness for public health emergencies. So what's unique about SPARK is that it truly focuses on the pediatric and special populations, and the scope of the technologies that we support are all regulated medical products, medical countermeasures, drugs, biologics, devices, diagnostics, digital health, and digital therapeutics. So really, as the principal investigator, I wrote and submitted the proposal to BARDA, my vision was to build a national program that would make sure that children are never left behind in preparedness planning. And it was no accident that we actually knew BARDA very well at the time. It was through our partnership with Johnson & Johnson Innovation and Blue Knight, which is a partnership between Johnson & Johnson Innovation and BARDA. So that's how we already knew BARDA and had a front row seat to all the good programmings that they had. Blue Knight is located right on the hospital's innovation campus. And so that experience gave us good view to how public-private partnerships can accelerate the development of life-saving technologies. You remember, Rich, when we were writing the proposal and when it came to bring SPARK to life, there was no better partner than BioHealth Innovation, because BioHealth Innovation has been a driving force in growing early-stage companies and connecting them with capital, mentors, and market opportunities. So together we designed SPARK as a bridge, linking innovators, pediatricians, and federal agencies to advance medical countermeasures specifically designed for children. So I would like to give a shout out to Dr. Kurt Newman, President Emeritus and former President and CEO of Children's National Hospital, who for years has been a leading national advocate for including children in every preparedness plan. So it was really his vision, voice, and leadership that paved the way for programs like the FDA-funded Alliance for Pediatric Device Innovation, which I led for 12 years, and SPARK to take hold.
Well, congratulations, Kolaleh, on your success in bringing these resources to what we call the BioHealth Capital Region. And BioHealth Innovation's proud to be a partner with you in this initiative. And now let's talk a little bit about some of the entrepreneurs that actually had to compete to become a part of this cohort, I would imagine. And we're going to start with Dori Jones, who's the co-founder and CEO of AcQumen Medical. Dori, welcome to BioTalk, and let's learn a little bit about you and your company.
Thank you so much for having me, Rich. And I will just put in that I like to think of SPARK and a lot of the pediatric resources as not competitive, but collaborative. It's an incredible community. We all want each other to succeed. But of course, we're very grateful to be part of this cohort. So my name is Dori. I'm the co-founder and CEO of AcQumen Medical. We're building a non-invasive hemodynamic monitor for pediatrics. My background is also in engineering, mechanical and biomedical engineering. So I love meeting fellow women mechies like Kolaleh. And I had an opportunity a few years to reconnect with an engineer that I had worked with in the past, who is an ultrasound expert. And he had this idea that ultrasound could directly address some of the limitations in today's non-invasive monitoring tools. And at that same time, my own son, who had been a NICU baby, was in and out of the hospital. He actually ended up back in the ICU when he was 4 months old in respiratory distress due to a viral infection. And I went back to the team. Thankfully, he recovered. And I said, we have to look at pediatric critical care. They just don't have the same tools and resources that they do in the adult centers. And thankfully, I've had the opportunity to work in both adult and pediatric healthcare. But I knew that there were these gaps. And so I started interviewing pediatric intensivists, neonatologists, a whole host of clinicians who said, we really need these types of tools for monitoring that are designed specifically for children and infants. So we started down this path, officially formed AcQumen in June of 2024. It was last fall that I first applied to SPARK and the BARDA program. And so I won't say that I knew nothing then, but it was definitely early in our journey, and we've learned a ton since. So super grateful to be part of the program.
Well, thanks for that introduction. The other thing is this SPARK Accelerator is a national and international program, even though it's sort of focused in Washington, D.C. around Children's National. Companies that are in this cohort are from all around the United States and world. So where's your company located, Dori?
We are based in Minneapolis.
Okay, very good. Well, welcome to the BioHealth Capital Region virtually. Our second entrepreneur that we have is Jugal Suthar, who is the co-founder and CEO of Vesynta. Jugal, would you like to introduce yourself and the company, please, and also tell us where you're located?
Well, firstly, thank you everyone on the team for having me on the podcast. It's a great honor. And of course, Rich, as you mentioned, I'm co-founder and CEO at Vesynta. We're a precision medicine company based at the London Cancer Hub in the UK. So actually, we're one of those few international companies that you mentioned who are sort of participating on the program. And we exist actually to promote equitable health outcomes in children using our patient-centric prescribing software, Dosalogic. It's powered by a unique marketplace that really connects clinicians to validated pharmacology models, helping children really receive an individualized dose and increasing the chance of their therapeutic success. So I co-founded Vesynta actually based on my personal experience as a hospital pharmacist in the NHS here, where I felt I lacked that actionable patient-specific insight when making those dosing decisions. And so I was forced to rely on this sort of one-size-fits-all approach to how I determine dosages for these patients. And of course, we know that does not wholly serve the diversity that we see within our pediatric populations. And I was seeing side effects in nearly 60% of the children that I was dealing with in the hospitals, and a tenfold increase in mortality, particularly in indications like on oncology and infectious disease. And overall, we did the numbers on this, and it cost healthcare systems nearly $300 billion globally. So naturally, I was very drawn to the SPARK program, given its emphasis on shifting how dose selections is informed as a specific medical countermeasure for children, which traditionally, to be honest, has been an area that's been underserved as an innovation area. And so during the program, we opened our seed funding round to help us really break into that US care provider market and become really the category defining company in trying to set a new foundation of prescribing infrastructure.
Thank you for your introduction. And I guess for both of you, as well as Kolaleh, you talk about an underserved population in pediatrics, which is a challenge. It's a challenge in getting partners. It's a challenge in getting investors. It's a challenge overall just because of the size of the market. But a lot of the pediatric innovation leads to adult solutions. So a lot of people don't understand that. But with all three of you, what do you see as the major challenge in developing these solutions for the pediatric populations? And in addition to that, what was the gap that you saw that you needed to address, Dori and Jugal?
That's such an important question, and it's one that's finally getting the attention it deserves. So developing medical solutions for children comes with a completely different set of challenges compared to adults. Everything that you mentioned, the market is smaller, the regulatory pathways are often less defined, and clinical trials are complicated and can be very complex because of the ethical and logistical considerations. And this phrase has become a cliche, but I say it. Nevertheless, children are not small adults. Their physiology, dosing requirements, and disease presentations can be very different. So solutions must be designed with that in mind. In my recent invited commentary in JAMA, which published on October 30th, I actually discuss how these structural barriers have historically slowed progress in pediatric innovation, particularly the lack of incentives, both in terms of carrots and sticks. dedicated infrastructure, sustainable funding, and clear reimbursement pathways. These are some of the barriers that I can see. But the good news is that we've now seeing some good momentum. I want to also mention the invited commentary that I published in JAMA just about 2 weeks ago. And perhaps we can put a link on that for some of your listeners to go and read.
Yeah, for the listeners, we'll actually do a transcription of this podcast and also publish it in the BioHealth Innovation newsletter. And you can put whatever links or contact information any of you would like to have for people to get in touch with you through that. So, Dori, let's go to you now. Talk about this underserved population. And more importantly, what was the primary gap that you thought you could benefit from by being a part of the SPARK Accelerator?
So I mentioned that we're building a non-invasive hemodynamic monitor for pediatrics. And, in pediatrics, non-invasive is not a nice to have. It's really crucial, especially when we're talking about the smallest and most fragile patients, which is neonates. So certainly I think there's a gap in resources in general to support pediatric innovation because so few people do it. I will comment that, one of my main sort of driving forces is that the med tech industry tends to do things backwards. They think, okay, we'll develop this adult product and maybe we'll get it made for kids or appropriate for kids. And they tend to not go down that pathway. So a lot of clinicians are using technologies off label, which is one of the unique challenges. I think about talking to some of these neonatologists, intensivists, anesthesiologists, where they don't have the level of guidelines and clinical research to back their everyday decisions. And so it's not just the patients that are unique, it's the clinicians that care for them as well. We have to think about things like, while we're non-invasive, we do have adhesive patches that go on the skin. So making sure that we're designing that's appropriate. Somebody that has sensitive skin, when you're talking about a premature baby, you can only use so many materials in your technology. But that said, building these soft and gentle devices is absolutely appropriate in the future for adults as well. So I like to think of building pediatric first and getting through those challenges and those hurdles, and then it becomes easier to scale it to other patient populations. But absolutely, as I said, the gap in resources can really be filled by programs like SPARK, and they have access to key opinion leaders. They have access to all of the different service providers that feed into the medical device industry. We don't have to just think about design. We have to be thinking about healthcare economics and reimbursement. We have to think about our regulatory pathway. How do we drive adoption once we do have a commercial product? Getting through the FDA is step one of many steps to getting your technology out to the patients that need it.
Thank you, Dori. Jugal, same question to you.
I think Kolaleh and Dori have touched on some great points there, difficult acts to follow. But what I would say from the perspective of precision dosing is the challenge that we see a lot is this continued emphasis or insistence on how we take adult dosing labels and how we can extrapolate them down to children during the drug development process, and almost believing and thinking that those dosing labels will then translate to safety and efficacious success once brought into the clinic. But what we're seeing is actually, of course, this is not the case. And so what we really need in the industry is a shift in that thought process and actually start designing from the ground up with a child lens. And I think the point made by Kolaleh regarding carrots and sticks is a good one, because fundamentally, if we can encourage and incentivize from a reimbursement or regulatory perspective, I think it will drive innovation in that particular space. Or if we can create, for example, trusted environments where we can be sharing real-world data from a pediatric perspective to drive those computational insights the way we are, again, it would drive and encourage innovation within the space that we're in. I should say, again, as Dori mentioned, it's actually been very advantageous to work in the pediatric space from a dosing perspective because, of course, off-label dosing is so prevalent in this population because of that variability in response we see between patients, because their physiological development is so variable and so fast. So actually, from trying to get a technology validated in the clinic faster and more cost effectively, it's a very good population to start with. And often what we find from the patient side, from the parent advocates, but also from the clinicians, there seems to be a stronger desire to innovate within this particular space. And I think actually we've seen that in our flagship success as well. So for example, all of our non-dilutive grants and sort of consortia-based projects are within the pediatric dosing space. And so there's a clear willingness, I think, to help and serve this population.
Excellent. And what about the primary gaps you wanted to address by joining this accelerator?
From my side, obviously, from Vesynta's side, not coming from the US and almost being a bit of an outsider, understanding the reimbursement pathway was a critical factor for us. We always talk about how the NHS is a fragmented system in terms of how technologies can be adopted, procured, and reimbursed. But of course, the US is not necessarily straightforward either, particularly when it comes to the pediatric reimbursement and the relationship between care providers, payers, and of course, how the MCOs play a part in that as well. And the distinguishing between private healthcare and the publicly available healthcare, I think, is genuinely new concepts for a relatively early company like ourselves to kind of get a grip of. And I think that was a knowledge gap, I think, that we wanted to really nail down. And one of the drivers for actually participating on the SPARK program. And of course, seeking that partnership with the entrepreneur in residence as well.
We're going to drill down on the entrepreneurs in residence in a little bit, but I'm going to go back to Dori here. And Dori, what do you think is the most significant inflection point that you've really had? You're in the 5th month, I think, of the 6-month cohort now, correct?
Yes.
So you're getting towards the end. And so what do you see as the greatest inflection point you've had in the first 5 months of this cohort as you're nearing the end of this SPARK project?
We joined this program at a really interesting time because we were still in the development of our first really working prototype of UltraTrack, our hemodynamic monitor. And so during this last 5 months, we have gotten to the point of having that fully functional and clinical grade UltraTrack model and actually received our first IRB approval for clinical validation studies. And so having the support from the SPARK Accelerator during that time, really helped us to address all of the various aspects of the device development process and really transitioning to being a clinical stage company where we have to think about additional factors like what insurance do we need in place, vendor credentialing. Actually walking into a hospital is very different than the product development stage. And of course, making sure that we understand our regulatory pathways and, the quality systems in place. And one of, I think, my favorite resources that the SPARK program provided was MedTech Innovation Cycle, where we can track all of the different aspects of this business process, not just product development, but all of the different, resources that feed into it. And it got me thinking about all of those steps in a different way so that we were fully prepared to move into that clinical study phase.
Sounds like great progress. And Jugal, same thing for you. What's the major inflection over the last 5 months that you've had?
Yeah, I think there's a couple I can probably put forward. From our perspective, we were still slightly unclear as to where we would sit from a regulatory perspective with our particular software. And actually, connections and talks through the SPARK program has actually helped us identify a very lean regulatory pathway where we can break into the US market as a non-device decision support tool, shaving off months in clinical evaluation and probably hundreds of thousands in study costs as well, which is, of course, very efficient and something that I think internally and also investors would love to hear. But also, again, as Dori mentioned, we joined the program just really a few months before our first clinical release. And actually, during the program, that's been achieved. And through the partnering aspect of the program, we've actually been able to secure user acceptance testing studies with various departments at Children's National to really assess the initial version of that particular software from a usability perspective and interoperability perspective before we release our full commercial release for US providers more generally. So I would say those are two important inflection points that we've covered off as part of this program.
So it's the first 5 months have been very worthwhile for both of you. And probably will have long-term effects on the direction the company goes. So we've been talking about BioHealth Innovation's Entrepreneur in Residence program, and each of you have had a chance to work with one or more of the EIRs. You're free to mention the EIR that you're working with as well, but talk a little bit about the relationship that you've developed with the EIR from BHI, and what do you see as the benefit in having a mentor like that associated with you in the SPARK Accelerator program? And I'm going to go back to Jugal first, because Dori's had the first all the time, and he's had to listen to what she said, and then sometimes he doesn't have something original to say. So, Jugal, you get to go first this time.
I would say this was a really nice surprise as part of the program to understand actually how hands-on and how robust the EIR support was as part of the journey. So we were very fortunate to be paired with Lolita Robinson and also getting support from Mona Suleiman as well. And specifically, having gone through the Gates review process and the fact that we are specifically paired with where our gaps are as a business, I think it's great. It means it's very tailored and it's not thrust upon you, but actually is commensurate with what the need is for the business. So that's a massive benefit of the program. Where we were lacking, of course, as mentioned earlier, it was what does the procurement and reimbursement pathways look for our technology with the payers and also the integration pathways into the customers as well? Because, of course, clinical integration has to go hand in hand in the way in which actually this technology is going to be reimbursed and incur cost. And not only thinking about value proposition, but how can our value proposition, being a UK-based company, how does that translate into the US healthcare ecosystem? How does it translate to the type of metrics that people care about when making those purchasing decisions? Of course, these are areas that we didn't have knowledge of, but the work through BHI and the EIR program has actually really helped us with, and we have the reports to show for it. From one of the key learnings from our perspective, as an example, we went into this program thinking that we would charge on a specific type of code. Clinicians would use our software and charge for the amount of time our software is being used to support decision-making. But actually, very quickly, we were advised, actually, your software would be used potentially to save care episode costs, to save on cost of discharge, and therefore would be looked at in a slightly different way from a metrics perspective. So these were, I think, really, really valuable learning points in terms of how we frame the software and how when we have those conversations with care providers and we're trying to sell them the value proposition, making sure that we're not saying something which is misaligned. And I think that's the key thing when you're having those early conversations. So yeah, really grateful for the program and Lolita and Mona's efforts on that.
Thank you for calling out Lolita and Mona, two of the stars of the BHI network. So, Dori, same thing for you, the interaction with the BHI EIRs.
I will share that within the medtech industry, I've worn a lot of hats: R&D, clinical research, quality, marketing. But this is my first time as a founder and first time as a CEO. And so thinking about things holistically and also fundraising specifically is a newer function to me. And I don't have that network of investors that some repeat CEOs and founders may have. So we were connected with EIR Susan Solinsky, who is herself an investor in the medical and biotech space. And she's been incredibly helpful in making connections for us, but also helping me thinking about how to position our business, not just our technology, but our business, and how to speak to investors, how to position ourselves and the excitement that we are generating with our technology, as a valid investment, even, with the limitations of a pediatric market, which a lot of people talk about it as small. I actually don't think it's very small, but you have so much opportunity because there's fewer barriers in some ways, like competition. And you really do get collaboration with regulators in the pediatric space. People want to be able to get technologies out to these pediatric clinicians and patients. So Susan's been really instrumental in helping us navigate the fundraising aspect, and not just for investors, but also what are some of the non-dilutive opportunities for us. Her team helped us with grant mapping early on in the process. So I'm super grateful to Susan and all the connections that she's made for us, and also helping me think about things from the investor perspective, putting on the investor hat, and also knowing how to research investors.
Now all you have to do is convince Susan to write a check for you, right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this 5-month experience or 6-month experience that you're going through. There's a new cohort that's going to be recruited to come in and do the second cohort of the SPARK Accelerator. What words of advice would you have for the people, number one, applying, and number two, what advice would you give to them that you've learned or gained through this program that might help them experience a very positive experience going through this cohort? Let's go back to Jugal. I'll go with you first.
First of all, I should say the SPARK Accelerator is well worth applying for. I think it's one of the better organized programs that certainly we've been part of here at Vesynta, and we've been on quite a few. I think it's a very clear, defined remit. It offers no-nonsense introductions that actually lead somewhere. One of my pieces of advice would be to attend everything. And whether it's the CEO in the company or someone close to the CEO, I think attend everything, whether it be sessions or whether it be EIR consultations or office hours available as well, because actually there is gold to find in every one of these talks. Some of it may not be particularly relevant in certain patches because there is such a variety of technologies on display, but I think there is something to take away in all of these talks. And there is obviously a risk. If you're not there at the table, then you don't necessarily find out what that specific insight may be.
Dori, how about you?
Yeah, so I mentioned the innovation cycle status wheel, the Gates wheel that we've been set up with. I would say definitely leverage that. It sort of helps you address what gaps you may have in your pathway and also ask a lot of questions. I think early on for me, one of my main questions was, what am I not thinking about? Because there's so many different aspects of the product development pathway, aspects of regulatory and reimbursement that all have to come together to create a valid business opportunity. And you can't be thinking of them all on your own. I think asking for help is something that I am trying to get better at, and knowing where you need those additional resources and how to bring them in. So ask a lot of questions. I mean, people like Kolaleh and the principal investigator at SPARK, they've done this before themselves, so they know the different things that you might be missing. And again, for me as a first-time founder, I know a lot about medical device development and commercialization, but I don't know what all of the questions are that I should be asking. So lean on those resources.
Any further reflections, Jugal? Or?
It was actually more a reflection on our process and how we extract, I guess, the most value out of programs like this, which is to be, when going into a program like this, I think being very clear about your requirements in terms of what are the areas that you think you might need supplementation with respect to support. And as Dori mentioned, I think the Gates review, I've not been through that process before. It was very sophisticated. It was very granular. It covered aspects such as your tech, your regulatory, your market, your business, and your clinical. So really all facets of the opportunity. And so going in with a clear set of requirements, but then being willing to adapt and adjust as to what those requirements actually look like when you go through something objective like the Gates review, I think is really critical, because that will set the foundation for what you're looking to extract out of the accelerator. I think being over ambitious in terms of how much you're looking to achieve and learn is almost sort of the downfall of potential participation, and just trying to be really precise and specific as to what you're trying to get out of the program will make the time worthwhile.
And then Kolaleh, you've been quiet for a while, so I'm going to come back to you. You've been an observer, and this is the first time in the first cohort for the SPARK Accelerator program. Tell me a little bit about your observations about the program overall, the process, things that you like about what is going on, and any things you see that might be able to be improved as we go forward with the second cohort on this program.
I fully agree with Dori and Jugal about, what resources companies should make sure that they take advantage of. So the Gates process that was mentioned, GAITS, it's a proven technology, was pressure tested during the RADIX program. And the developers of that methodology are out of Mass General. So that's, again, the power of partnership, that SPARK included the group at Mass General to join us in this accelerator program to teach that methodology and make that tool available to all the companies that participate. I want to also acknowledge the role of BARDA, that had the vision of, as a federal agency, they have a lot of strengths. There are lots of opportunities that companies are encouraged to tap on within BARDA for follow-on fundings. And SPARK's role is to navigate that process and make it easy for the companies. BARDA had the vision to marry the strength of that federal agency, BARDA, with the agility and creativity of early-stage companies such as AcQumen and Vesynta. So that's very unique, and I really hope that all the companies take advantage of. And the third, I wanted to, we talked about that, but it's so important that the end goal should not be regulatory authorization in forms of listing, clearance, and approval. That's not the end game. And, the companies should really start thinking about health economics reimbursement at the get-go. And the advantage of SPARK is that it's the only accelerator hub that is based in a hospital. So take advantage of connectivity with the clinicians and the reality of the health systems. So many products achieve their regulatory goal, but they sit on the shelf for years or die, at that stage, after regulatory authorization, and they will never see the light of benefiting patients and being in the hospitals and healthcare working for them. So I think that is so unique. And when I was writing this proposal, I really wanted to emphasize that's the strength of this hub that has access to hospitals and clinicians. So clinical validation and early validations could be made available to entrepreneurs from the get-go.
The other thing that I'd like to ask is, you have a chance for 6 entrepreneurs going through similar challenges together, even though they have different products, technologies, and markets. Dori and Jugal, what's the benefit of having the interaction or the connectivity to other entrepreneurs going through similar challenges? And have there been any discussions amongst the cohort with each other about how they can support one another?
Just to say quickly from my side, I think having strong cohesion within a cohort goes a long way, particularly, again, being a non-US entity, and to be able to speak to individuals who operate within that jurisdiction. I think we can learn so much from them and their day-to-day operations, which they would take for granted, which seemed new to us in the first place. We gained a lot of help on the fundraising side. So, of course, breaking into the US investor market is naturally a little bit more difficult for a UK or European-based entity. And so to be able to have those warm introductions, I think, was a very easy and obvious task for us. And I think the cohort were all too willing to offer those introductions to people within their network who we deemed to be potentially a good fit. So that's sort of one area where we felt having that ecosystem, those other companies within the Accelerator really helped us and has actually translated to us being in late stage diligence with some of those funds.
Congratulations. Dori, anything on your side?
I mentioned at the very beginning the kind of collaborative nature of this community. I think it's very powerful. And I've been in other forums or events where there are other founders, but not from the healthcare space, or definitely not from the pediatric healthcare innovation space. And so asking the right questions sometimes comes from hearing the other companies asking questions. How are they thinking about this? What is their perspective that they bring? And very specific to our niche market within pediatrics. So I think it's been incredible, not just hearing from the other companies, but collaborating with them and learning from each of them in their own journeys.
One more thing to add, sorry, where I will be looking to lean on the cohort next, probably, is thinking about examples of commercial contracts and licenses, particularly within the digital health space that is commonplace. I think, again, that's a bit of a dark art sometimes, and to really understand precedent in that respect as to what's worked from a commercial and legal framework side of things is something of great value when you have a cohort like that operating within this particular space.
We've learned a lot about the SPARK Accelerator program in your companies, and I think what we'll do is 6 months from now, follow up with all 3 of you and talk about what happened after you graduated from the cohort, and were you able to keep this momentum building with all of the suggestions and advice and connections that have been made through this process. So before we close, though, we've been talking to Dori Jones, the co-founder and CEO of AcQumen Medical. Anything else you'd like to let the listeners know, Dori? And then when you close, please let everybody know your contact information so they can get in touch with you if they'd like.
One thing that I'd like to say is we talk a lot about the challenges in pediatric healthcare innovation. I think there's a ton of opportunity, and I'd like to share some of the success stories. Jugal, I'm excited to follow you and the other cohort companies. Let's spread the word about the companies that are doing this well and doing it right and actually making progress on the commercial side once they've navigated all of these different pathways. And so I'm really excited to be able to come back and share where we are 6 months from now. Not that it will necessarily be commercial, but certainly I think we can move rapidly in this pediatric space because of the support that we get from resources like SPARK, but also from the clinicians that are hungry for solutions for their patients, something designed specifically for these pediatric patients, which is so rare. really excited to follow all of the companies and share their successes.
And how do people contact you?
djones@acqumenmedical.com. Check out our website, AcQumenmedical.com, to learn more about UltraTrack and what we're building. And I'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you, Dori. Jugal, same thing for you.
Sure. I mean, I'd actually like to start by mentioning one of the key outputs from the SPARK Accelerator, which I didn't get a chance to mention before. I wasn't quite sure when it would come up, but you could probably class this as an inflection point. But actually, as a company, we've started off with clinical validations in the pediatric oncology space. But actually, through the SPARK program, we've been able to diversify and expand through the partnership offering that the program provides. So we've had conversations now with the rheumatology departments and the infectious disease departments at Children's National to go as far as actually submitting a joint research proposal under the SPARK Dev program in collaboration with the infectious disease department and the pharmacy department. So that project will actually look at developing specific dosing models for antibiotics as a medical countermeasure in special pediatric populations, with the view then to pilot those validated models post-project. So just to mention that that is a fantastic delivery of success as a result of the Accelerator program. From Vesynta's perspective, looking forward, we continue to seek that sort of collaboration, whether it be sharing of real-world data for dose model development and validation, but also piloting the platform and specific dose models within pediatric populations. And of course, looking for investors to close the seed funding round that I mentioned earlier, those who are really interested in backing what we think is going to be the new standard in prescribing decision support. So if listeners represent either of those types of organizations, then of course, I'd love to hear from you. And you can reach me at jugal.suthar@vesynta.com.
If you don't mind, can you spell that out for everybody, Jugal?
Of course, yes. Jugal, JUGAL.Suthar, SUTHAR, at Vesynta, VESYNTA.com. And our website is vesynta.com, where you can learn more about Dosalogic and how it works.
Thank you, Jugal, who is co-founder and CEO of Vesynta. And then we'll close with whom we opened with, which is Kolaleh Eskandanian. Kolaleh, great program, and you can tell through the enthusiasm from the entrepreneurs who have been participating, Dori and Jugal, and the others in that cohort, what a success it has been already. But I think it really speaks to the private-public partnership nature of this. You have a federal agency with BARDA, you have Children's National Hospital, you have BioHealth Innovation, another nonprofit, you have independent entrepreneurs and residents working with the cohort companies. So it's the true collection of bringing a lot of resources together who have a common goal. So, Kolaleh, how would you like to summarize sort of this first SPARK cohort, and what do you see for the future?
Very short. It's really the beauty of this public-private partnership is the purpose and the vision from the government, from the public sector, with the drive from the private sector, the agility and the drive that these companies bring to marry with the vision that the government has and wrap around all the services such as BHI EIR services, access to clinicians, access to regulatory and reimbursement experts. Through that, I'm really hoping that, we can make sure that children benefit from novel technologies first and not last. So the theme of pediatric first came out a couple of times during our conversation, and I hope that, we will achieve that through SPARK program for sure.
Thank you very much, Kolaleh, Dori, and Jugal. I also want to mention Kamran Tariq, who we've been working very closely with on the SPARK program, and thank him for all of his efforts. We look forward to continued work with him and all of the other leaders within the SPARK Accelerator program. So thank you all for being on BioTalk today. And I'm sure that the listeners have learned something new, as I have, related to pediatric technology and innovation, and the important role that you're playing to help serve in addressing those needs of children around the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.